In studio with us is the CEO of a venture called Justworks, which we are going to find out about in our discussion. Isaac Oates is joining us in studio on this portion of our program, and he has an interesting background to share with us. We're going to be talking about things that I think will interest those of you who fall into the category of being employers, as well as those of us who are employees. And I'll just throw that out as a tease to begin us in this discussion. Isaac, first of all, it's nice to have you join us.
Good morning. Thank you.
And good morning to you. I guess in beginning our discussion, we're going to be talking a good deal about this venture, Justworks, in the course of our discussion because it ties in very well with a couple of different areas where I want to go. But I always like to provide some background for folks listening to our discussions here on Sunday mornings, background on the guests. How did Justworks come about?
So first, it's a bit. I basically started my career at Amazon.com as a software engineer, where I worked on these very large, scalable systems, and I started to see the power of how you could use these massive systems to reduce costs for small sellers on a marketplace, for example. As I kind of moved through my career, I started a company called Adtuitive, which was a contextual ad platform, and that was here in New York. And then moved on to Etsy, which had bought our company called Adtuitive. And at Etsy, that was really an opportunity to build this multi-currency, multi-billion-dollar processing platform where we made it really, really easy for Etsy sellers, most of whom are individuals, to actually sell their products and accept credit card payments really seamlessly and at a very low cost. All at the same time, I was an intelligence officer in the National Guard, and so that gave me this sense of what was happening in terms of government regulation and how to work with the government. But there were really two things during that I saw. The first was how difficult it was to employ people and just write that first paycheck. So at this startup, Adtuitive, we'd raised a Series A, very, very excited to hire some employees and cut some checks. And little did I know what I was in for to get that going. And when I spoke with other entrepreneurs, they confirmed that it was just as painful for them as it was for me. And the second thing that I saw primarily at Etsy while I was building their payments platform was this capability where you could really aggregate many people under one system and essentially make things really easy for them where it would have been difficult otherwise.
All right, I got to ask you a couple questions based on some of the things that you've said, but I also want to share something with folks listening to us. And, I always feel like a dinosaur when I say something like this to a guest such as yourself. Relatively speaking, you're a young person.
Sure.
You've had an awful lot of experience in a relatively short period of time. How has that benefited you?
I mean, I think that an important part of developing in your career is breadth and seeing lots of different things. I think I've been very fortunate in being presented with a lot of different opportunities, both at companies like Amazon, where I got to join, just as that company was having massive scale. And then also, things like the military, which I essentially could do in parallel with that career. So I really just have had an opportunity to do a lot of things and see a lot of things.
Why did you join the Guard?
So it's funny. It was sort of a little bit spur of the moment. So there was a Monday when I was 17 years old when a recruiter called my mother actually and left a message, and I called back. And by Friday, I had sworn in, actually here in Brooklyn. And I was looking for a little bit of a change, and I looked at something like the military, and it was so fascinating to see just this whole different world, and this kind of really big organization that I could be a part of.
What is it? Because this is intriguing me, listening to different things that you're saying. What is it that motivates you to seek these different kinds of ideas and opportunities?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is just curiosity and, learning about different like how the world works, basically, which to me is just a thing that is really fascinating. And then I think also I have a strong service ethic. So I believe very much in doing things that are helpful to other people. I mean, I'm only here for a limited period of time on Earth, and I'd just like to walk away having done some good stuff.
Now, being at Amazon at the period of time when basically things, I guess one could say, sort of exploded with Amazon. What was that like?
Well, it was pretty cool. The systems that we worked on, so I did primarily these sort of payment processing and data processing systems. And, essentially when you're in a business like that, you don't really know how to build sort of the end game. I mean, that's such a different company today, certainly than it was even when I worked there or when it had started. And so the kinds of challenges that I was facing were to take a system. For example, I worked on a payment system where we processed about 85,000 transactions a day. So it's like one a second. Mm-hmm. And we were getting to this point where the system just couldn't do it anymore. It would get backed up and things would take a long time to go through and people would ask, what is happening with my order? And, the task in front of me was to take a system like that and make it so that it can handle, call it 10 times or 100 times the capacity. And, knowing, of course, that, the future version of me is going to have to go fix it, when the company is 100 times bigger. So, I mean, having that kind of experience just gave me some really great tools to kind of learn how you manage that.
Great reference to the future version of me. When you think about the way in which technology has changed the work world, let's also tie this into the way in which Justworks operates, because things have changed drastically from the standpoint of, I mentioned earlier about, employers versus employees, but for the standpoint of employers, what can technology enable us to do?
I think it can enable quite a lot. If you look at what an employer is faced with, and Justworks is primarily focused on small businesses because I think the pain point is most extreme for small businesses. There's just a huge amount of regulation and requirements that a small business has to do just to exist and just to not get fined. Let's call it that. So, you look at all of the different requirements like workers' comp insurance and, registering for the appropriate taxes, which, if you're, for example, like if you're here in the tri-state area, you might have to register with the state of New York and then also with Connecticut and New Jersey because you have employees that live there. And this is stuff that no one should spend their time doing. It's just, it's like a non-differentiated, non-productive activity. And, it's just a fact of a sort of fragmented government with really arcane systems and no, there's no real incentive for quote unquote the government to fix it because there are actually many different ones. And so I think that's our job, to basically roll it together and give a business owner one place to go.
When you said that about, the pain point and small business owners today, do they have to feel like they're in this David versus Goliath situation?
Well, I think it does feel a little bit like that because there are, if you look at the sort of any activity that a business owner is doing, there's always the fixed costs and the variable cost. And if you're a massive corporation, if you're Amazon.com, you can afford the fixed costs and it's no big deal. But if you're a small business owner, those same, both a large corporation and a small business have to file the same returns to the government. So, from a proportional perspective, you've got a business owner that's maybe spending a couple days, a week per month just doing this paperwork. Whereas if you're, that could be somebody's full-time job at a big company. So I think it's tough for a business to be competitive because they just have this burden that's sort of disproportionate.
What vision do you have for Justworks?
So we look at ourselves, this is a little geeky, but we look at ourselves as building this operating system or command center for the small business. And by the small business, we mean all of them. So we essentially want to be the place that a business owner or their team can go to manage all of their non-differentiated activities, by which I mean just all the things that a business has to do that aren't actually making them better at being a business. We want to be the one place that they go and offer that service as low a cost as possible so that it can be really accessible and just help business get better at what they're doing.
Now, you used the word, I think you've used this word twice in this discussion, this concept of geek or geeky. I mean, is that insulting when somebody says that to you? Or do you embrace the term?
I think in high school it's something you look out for, but I think in in sort of today's age, I think it's become like a really strong thing. I think there's so much you can do with these sort of, technical skills and systems that I think is very powerful.
One of the things that I'd read in preparation for our discussion today, and we're talking with Isaac Oates, who is CEO of Justworks. Justworks is on the web, by the way. Justworks, that's all this one word.com, is the website. And Isaac is with us this hour of our program on the Fan. He's in studio with us. I'm Bob Salter. You're not shy about saying that you have the worst job in America. Why?
Well, so essentially what we're doing is the thing that business owners hate to do. So it's all of these taxes and paperwork and compliance. I love this stuff because this is what we do. So, for a regular business owner, it really is doing nothing to help them. But for us, this is our business. And it's really an opportunity to build, large scale systems like you saw at an Amazon or, that you might see in the military, and to really use those systems to solve problems. And so even though we deal with thousands of government agencies and, we ship data all over the place to make that work, for us, I think it's actually quite fascinating.
Now, keeping up to date with the various changes that take place, like with the tax codes, because you got to be up to snuff on city, state, and federal tax code changes. Is that kind of a juggling act?
It is. I mean, the taxes change quite often, and we subscribe to services, for example, that give us updates on those taxes so that we can make sure that we stay on top of that stuff for our customers. But the good news is we just do it, and then you don't have to. But yeah, there's a lot changing at any given time, and it is a lot to keep up with.
It's an interesting area to go into, but the other thing is, some of the people listening to us might know the fact that when it comes to working with payroll, you're not the only company that does this, right?
There are lots of companies that do payroll. It's a massive industry.
So how competitive a field does this become?
Well, it's competitive. So there are some huge incumbents in the space. That you could look at the market as like $100 billion market, essentially. But in terms of how we're differentiated, I think we've done a lot that is really quite different than what you see out there. And so, among other things, because we use a model called co-employment, where we essentially file taxes using our federal ID number instead of a company's federal ID number. So from a business's perspective, it's almost as if they have no employees, and then we have their employees. This is really just from a tax perspective. So there aren't a lot of companies that do that, and there are no other companies that combine, a really easy to use software solution, a website, justworks.com, with that approach.
We're in discussion with Isaac Oates, who is CEO of Justworks. Justworks, that's all this one word.com, the website for the company. There's a lot of information you've shared with us thus far. We're going to get into talking about discussion about perks, and from a standpoint of perks that both employees and the bottom line both can love. We'll get into talking about that in just a moment or two here. But when we talk about municipalities and states, how much, for lack of a better term, variation is there between those?
Well, there's a pretty significant variation between different states and municipalities, and there are really a few things that are behind that. So there's sort of the obvious stuff, like, how many taxes do you have to pay? Are there city taxes? Are there not city taxes? There are a couple of states that we work in, such as Pennsylvania and Ohio, that have unbelievably complicated taxes for their customers. And then there are sort of the other factors that are in terms of doing business. So things like the cost of benefits. So, medical insurance, especially for a small business in New York State, or at least here in the tri-state area, is very, very expensive compared to other markets. And, and then there are, of course, the other costs, the cost of transportation and energy and real estate, which really add up. So I think if you look at New York City, it is essentially the most expensive place in the country to do business. But the flip side is that you have amazing access to capital and talent here, which I think is why a lot of companies come to New York.
When you look at New York City versus other cities, what's the difference when it comes to taxes?
Well, so in terms of the city of New York, I mean, they're essentially just the state and the city taxes. When you go to other cities, they may or may not. So in a state like Pennsylvania, for example, there are these local services taxes that are imposed by different tax collectors in different districts that may or may not even have to do with the town you're in. And so really where the differences come in is how many checks do you have to write every month to different authorities and how many returns do you have to do? And we see people get pretty snowed under with this stuff.
I can imagine. So how much, is there any kind of guesstimate as to how much time, for lack of a better term, is wasted by business owners trying to accomplish all that?
Yeah, I think if you're lucky, it's a day or two a month. I think more realistically, you're talking about upwards of a week a month.
Wait a minute. Hang on for a second. Did you just say a day or two a month?
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you look at sort of the constituent activities in terms of running your business, I mean, think about all of the things that you have to do. So you have to manage your relationship with all of these governments. Like that is a thing that's happening. You have to, write checks every month, and, file taxes every quarter. You have to manage your business's insurance, which if you don't have, that can be a massive problem for you. If you offer benefits, you probably are managing them directly. So, every time an employee starts, for example, you need to ship a form off to your insurance broker to get them added to your medical policy. There are things like a 401k, if you can even offer these, or transit benefits where, you, the business owner, are basically, managing both the payroll system to maybe do some deductions and then also writing checks to those providers and maybe even handing out transit cards, for example. It's really, really time consuming.
And when we look at for a business owner, how often, or I guess maybe not even so much how often, but what are some of the typical kind of errors or mistakes that they're going to make when they're dealing with, payroll, when they're dealing with taxes?
I think there are a few that are real doozies. So one is the contractor versus employee piece. So people, there's a gray area between whether a person might be considered an independent contractor or an employee, and if you get it wrong, that can be a very, very costly mistake. There are also things like, do I classify an employee as salaried versus hourly? Turns out you don't just get to pick. There are laws about this. Failing to secure that workers' comp or disability insurance, which the state will absolutely nail you as soon as they figure it out, and they have computer systems that help them figure it out. Not filing or not keeping an I-9 that documents your employee's ability to work, having an unpaid intern, when you shouldn't. There's all kinds of stuff.
What exactly is an I-9?
So an I-9 is an immigration form. It essentially it's a 2-page document that every employer is required to hold for every employee that works for them. And essentially this form, it's like a worksheet, but it essentially documents an employee's ability to work in the United States. So, many people have experienced this when they start a new job, and within 3 days, maybe the HR person says, "Hey, can I get your social security card and your driver's license or your passport?" This is list A and list B or list C. And so, they essentially have to document your ability to work if you're on a visa or whatever. And the funny part about this form is that you don't actually mail it anywhere. So all you have to do is fill it out and everybody has to sign it, and then you put it in a folder somewhere. But if you get audited and you don't have the form, it can be thousands of dollars as a penalty.
Literally because you don't have the form.
Right, because you haven't documented that your employees can legally work here.
Used to be this discussion about the IRA or individual retirement account and 401ks, and obviously there are other types of benefit plans these days too. How specific do things get with those when you're working with them?
Well, in terms of a company offering a 401k, that's something we work with them on, and we have a provider that we integrate with. But There are a lot of any benefit that has like a pre-tax approach to it is heavily regulated, because that's the government giving out money. Like, it's not cash maybe, but they're essentially saying, hey, here you can, defer taxes on this investment that you're making. And so as soon as you kind of enter that, you essentially have all of this oversight. If you're a business owner with a 401k, you may need to get your plan audited, and you certainly need to file with the government and basically prove that, you are doing things right and you're not just taking advantage of a tax break that you shouldn't have.
Well, how do employees know if they even need a 401k?
I would argue that most employees should have a 401k, whether or not they think they need it. It is really, it's free money. So it's important to save for retirement. Pensions are not, really not available in the way that they used to be, and certainly not with a small business. And so I would argue that basically all businesses should offer a 401k, but the challenge is that, the overhead is so high in offering a plan like this that most small businesses don't. And so that's a huge part of our product and a huge part of why people sign on with us.
So what are we talking about in terms of the overhead if it's that prohibitive?
So, it's easily a couple $1,000 a year to have the plan. So I'm not talking about 401k matching or anything like that, but just to have the plan and have an administrator do all of the filings for you is a couple $1,000s a year.
Mm-hmm. Been a lot of talk, obviously, too, about the minimum wage and about the idea of raising the minimum wage. People fall on both sides of that discussion. What are the major pros and cons?
Well, so, really, when you talk about things like minimum wage or even, like a paid sick leave law or any of these kinds of things, they're all really discussions about income inequality. Mm-hmm. And so in the case of minimum wage, first there are some arguments you could make. So, for example, there's the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25. And then there's, here in New York, the minimum wage is $8. And so it's not even a single minimum wage. There's actually different minimum wages across the country. And I think the pro, of course, of raising a minimum wage is it is good for employees, and especially those that are on that side of the inequality spectrum. The flip side, of course, is that it's more expensive for businesses if the type of employees that they have are minimum wage employees. So I think there really are two sides to that argument. And, our job is really to help business owners at least understand what the minimum wage is so that they can be in compliance.
Is there a lot of confusion about exactly what it is on the part of business owners?
I think if you're a business owner and you're in a locality, you tend to know what the minimum wage is where you live. So if you're hiring a remote employee, for example, who in all likelihood is not being paid minimum wage, then you might not know that it's different in different states or cities, but you generally know what it is.
Well, wait a minute. If you're hiring a remote employee, then would that employee actually be covered by the minimum wage, let's say here?
No, they wouldn't. So this is one of those things that gets absolutely crazy for a business is if you, and this is happening more and more, if you have a distributed workforce. So this was our startup, 5 years ago, where we had an employee in Texas and an employee that lived in Northern Virginia. Your business is essentially operating in all of the places where your employees are living. And that means you're subject to all of the rules and tax requirements and minimum wage laws and whatever else they have going on in every single jurisdiction, which is pretty nuts.
Wait a minute. Does that mean, let me just make sure I heard you correct. Does that mean then that the overall business is subject to all of these different state and local laws in all these areas? As
it pertains to employment, absolutely.
What about taxes?
Well, it can get a little trickier in terms of whether your business entity is licensed or has a certificate of authority in different states. So that's a little more case by case. But you can by having an employee in a different state essentially incur tax liabilities there.
Interesting the way in which the laws have been constructed to also reflect some of this, because I'm assuming laws have changed over the years in large part to take advantage of, from the standpoint of the municipalities and the jurisdictions, of the fact that there can be extra revenue.
I think that's absolutely true. First, I think that the incentives that you have from these different municipalities are, for each one of them, it's just their own municipality. And so for them, they're trying to make the most money they can and also operate the way that they see most appropriate. And so because for them, like the scope is basically just them. So the business that like spans the scope of multiple states or cities or whatever is really the one that's where the onus is to kind of comply with this stuff, which I think is really difficult and challenging. And then in terms of the taxes, I mean, there's just a huge amount of filing there.
We're in discussion on our program with Isaac Oates. He's been with us since we started our show after our 6 o'clock update. He is CEO of Justworks on the web at Justworks. That's all as one word, and that is with an S.com. A lot we've talked about, we've mentioned this idea of mandatory sick leave. In New York City, the idea of instituting this has generated some level of controversy. First of all, what's really behind that? And secondly, what kind of a trend are we seeing with this in other cities?
So I think in terms of sick leave, first, why is this such a hot topic in the media? And as we were talking about with minimum wage, I think this is related to income inequality. And, that's always a lightning rod topic and just something that everybody is on the side of income inequality. You may be on one side or the other, but you're on a side. And I think it's just one of those kinds of issues. In terms of New York City's paid sick leave law, it was modeled after the laws that have recently passed in San Francisco, Seattle, and Connecticut. And essentially, the city looked at those laws and at what was happening here in New York. And I think the challenge is that if you're working for a large corporation, they have paid sick leave. This was part of what was in your offer letter. This is just coming with the job. And it's really those employees that are on the same ones that maybe are making minimum wage, where they may not be able to take time off if they're sick or their family member is sick. And that's what the law is meant to address. I think the thing that's really different about the law here is that I mentioned San Francisco, Seattle, Connecticut, and I believe there are other cities as well. But generally, those don't apply to businesses with less than 20 employees. But here in New York, it applies to businesses with 5 or more employees. So really, it applies to many more businesses here.
And when we talk about the idea of regulations, things that affect businesses, a discussion on this topic would not be complete without a reference to what has come to be known as Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act. What is the rollout of this, the impact of that like on small businesses?
So the Affordable Care Act is I think it's difficult pretty much for everyone to comprehend, small businesses included. So, I mean, the first thing to know is that even though the law itself was a massive law in terms of just pages of legislation, a lot of the rulemaking really happens after the law is passed. This is actually is very similar to the paid sick leave law. So there's, the legislation, and then essentially the government agency that's responsible for it has to go back and actually define the rules about how the program is going to work. So even though the law was passed, maybe a year and a half ago, I forget exactly the date, it then basically took the entirety of last year for the Department of Labor and other departments to write the rules. And so, while that was happening, there's tremendous uncertainty. And I think even today, people are a little bit confused about it. But what you can basically boil it down to is that, A, if you have less than 50 employees, this doesn't directly impact you. And B, it creates an alternative where you, instead of securing small group insurance, can actually send your employees to the exchange. If you're over 50 employees, you can't do that. You'll get penalized. So I think those are the really big points. And I think it's tough, especially because small group medical insurance can be very, very expensive, and the prices are regulated. And so you actually see a lot of companies sort of dropping that kind of insurance and sending their employees to the exchanges. And we're offering a product that should alleviate that to some extent. But
how complicated is that? Really, I guess it's almost like a maze of regulations.
It's very complicated. I mean, it's the nexus of the healthcare requirements as well as tax requirements. And so on the health side, the intent of the law is to make sure that the insurance policies that people are buying have a minimum level of coverage, and to make sure that the that the pools, the risk pools are managed appropriately. So a good example would be, it used to be when you went to get individual insurance until this year, they could ask questions about your health history and they could essentially change the price on that. And now if you go to the individual market, there's a very limited amount of information they can use to price.
Earlier in our discussion, you talked about the idea of, when some people are treated as contractors. In New York State, what is happening with that with small businesses? Are there situations where they're getting fined as a result of treating people as contractors and then finding out that they shouldn't have?
So there are a lot of things happening with contractors. I would call this the number one pitfall that I see with small businesses. I mean, first, a lot of business owners aren't even sure whether a person that's working with you should be classified as an employee or a contractor. And it's a gray area anyway, because you can look at an employee and say, there are these sort of behavioral factors, financial factors, and then the documentation that goes with that. And all of this is sort of taken into consideration. What you see with the state and in many states is that there's a policy side, which is that there are a lot of laws written to protect employees. But if you're a contractor, then you're sort of considered a business that's doing business with another business, and none of those laws apply. And so to the extent that they see somebody avoiding those laws and requirements, like the I-9 that we talked about before, which is not required for contractors, they get very up in arms about that because you're essentially avoiding these protections. The second part is a revenue piece. And so it's very difficult for a state or really any level of government to pass a new kind of tax or even change tax rates. But you can change enforcement pretty easily. And so I think what you're seeing in the past, call it 5 years or so, is, that there is increasing pressure on these state governments, to bring their budget together. And so essentially they're increasing enforcement of these laws, and that actually is helping. Not to mention that if you have somebody who's a contractor instead of an employee, you're not paying into the unemployment system, which in and of itself is a tax stream.
I didn't ask this earlier in this discussion, but this I think would be an appropriate question to ask now, especially for anybody who just joined us. Some people are small business owners themselves. What's actually mandatory in terms of insurance for small businesses?
Well, so the biggest one is workers' comp insurance. In every state except Texas, it's required when you have at least a handful of employees. But here in New York, it's required when you have even one employee. And so, workers' comp is basically, it protects your employee in case they get hurt. And it, generally the coverage is up to $1 million per incident. And so if you don't have that insurance, then essentially the state can cross-reference your tax filings with your coverage information, and you'll just get a letter in the mail that says you owe $2,000 to $10,000.
Not exactly the thing most of us want to receive in the mail. Now, let's turn our attention to something I've alluded to a couple of different times in this discussion, the idea of perks. And when we talk about perks these days, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, so I think that a lot of people have seen the movie The Intern, at Google. And, I think that there's a belief that maybe you have to offer, Google-like perks to be competitive, certainly in the tech space and maybe outside of that as well. I think if you look at the kinds of perks that employees really appreciate, you can basically look at the subset where it's great for the employee and also doesn't cost a ton of money to the employer, or it actually creates ancillary benefits back to the employer. So I'm not really talking about a foosball table or air hockey, but things like, paying for education or conferences, offering pre-tax commuter benefits, maybe paying for all or part of a gym membership, things like this that are really good for the employee, maybe help them save on out of pocket, but also give you this healthier workforce and a happier workforce.
Hang on for a second. Now, we were looking outside before during the last sports update and messages. I think there'd be actually some good room out there for a foosball table and maybe some air hockey table setups too. This concept of, people being able to telecommute in some cases, what effect is that having on the way in which businesses are operating and even the kind of perks that then are offered to that employee or employees?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing with a remote workforce. So on one hand, you have potentially some cost savings, and you get access to a different talent pool. So if you're here in New York and you can hire somebody remotely who lives in San Antonio, that employee's cost of living is much lower, and so you're able to pay less and still actually be very competitive. I think the flip side of that model is that you get much more communications overhead, and so you have to work. Where you're in an office with everybody, it's pretty easy to speak with people on a regular basis. I think you have to have much more structure in your business around communication if you're going to have remote employees. And then, of course, there's sort of the compliance side, which is that now you're sort of giving yourself additional responsibilities. And so I think using a service like Justworks would help there.
What about things like education? Because that's one area where sometimes companies will be involved in promoting the idea of their employees actually furthering their education.
First of all, I think this is great for everybody. So, for the employer, they're essentially developing a more educated workforce. Mm-hmm. And so, they should get returns on that in terms of productivity and efficiency. Obviously, for the employee, they're developing skills that they can use not just in their job or maybe to get a promotion or more pay or whatever, but they're also developing skills that they can take with them to their next job or even just use in life. And so, I think, to the extent that an organization is able to provide education for its employees, it is fantastic.
The idea of keeping fit, working out, what can employers do there?
Well, unfortunately, there's not sort of a pre-tax gym membership type thing. Maybe this will happen one of these days. But, we see a lot of companies offer a stipend, for example, to just help cover the cost of a gym membership. And the other thing that you can do, which is less financial, is you can essentially say, and I saw this a lot in the military, for example, hey, like at lunch, you can go to the gym. And so I think that just sort of addressing how important it is to stay fit is very important. In fact, my wife used to work at the county in Seattle, and there they have Stretch Club 3 times a week for 15 minutes, and everybody stretches in the elevator bay to keep limber.
Well, this is an interesting idea. And actually, I can see the benefits of that not only for the employees, but for the overall productivity of the venture. Last area I want to ask you about, those of us who own pets. What can employers do that can benefit us?
So I personally am a huge fan of dogs in the workplace. At my previous job, which was at Etsy, my dog was essentially also the company dog. So everybody knew my dog. His name is Milo, and he came to lots of our meetings. And actually, having dogs in the workplace it's great. They reduce the tension. You have a stressful meeting, and then the dog shows up. And I think they're flip side because you have to have a friendly dog. But I think dogs in the workplace is really helpful.
Some very cool ideas that you have shared with us. Isaac Oates, who is CEO of Justworks, Justworks, that's with an S.com, the website. Thank you very much. Certainly good luck with this venture.
Thank you, Bob.